We've all been in Zooms for so long now that we know to put our hands up and take them down when we want to speak, but sometimes we do still talk on mute. It happens to me a lot, so keep that in mind, and we'll move on. So Patrick, if you can put your hand up. Patrick's the CEO of Country Needs People. Thank you for joining us. From Wheatbelt NRM, we have from Aboriginal Ranger Program, Judd Stead, who's doing seed delivery for us. There's Judd up the top there. Carla Swift, I'm not sure, has joined us yet. There she is. Hi, Carla. Hi. Carla's the Business Development Manager for Wheatbelt NRM. And we have Dr. Malcolm Lindsey from Environs, Kimberley, with us, who was just updating us on the terrible situation with the flooding up north. So thank you very much. We have some apologies. The Telturack Rangers, Peter Bednall, contacted me yesterday saying they're having one of those moments when everyone is sick. There's no one to attend. They apologised. And the new project coordinator from the state DBCA Aboriginal Ranger Program, Helena Waldman, is an apology. She's new into the role. She'll be joining us in May for a Landcare Build Skills on innovation in the Aboriginal Ranger Program space. So watch your inboxes for that one. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Patrick. Patrick, each person has about 8 minutes to have give us a spiel about what you do and your thoughts, and then we've got 3 minutes for questions rather than having a panel and questions at the end. I think after each speaker, because of the diversity of the areas, and you're going to give us a bit of the national perspective. So over to you.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to be speaking to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country over here in Canberra. So I'm based in Canberra these days and work with Country Needs People. We're a non-profit that works nationally to support stronger Indigenous land and sea management, community-led Indigenous land and sea management, principally through Indigenous protected areas and Indigenous ranger work, but that's not the only way we support it. We have about 43 odd groups in our partners network, and we basically work everywhere from Torres Strait to WA, South Australia, Victoria, etc. We don't speak on behalf of any traditional owner group, but we work alongside them to help them strengthen their own land and sea management work. Jacqueline's asked me to give a bit of a national overview. We do focus a considerable effort on advocacy and lobbying, if you like, both federal and state governments. And the most relevant thing to the work that you guys are talking about is that we're probably the principal advocate for funding for Indigenous Rangers across the country. And we, at the last federal election, we managed to land one of our number one asks, which was the commitment to double Indigenous Ranger jobs nationally between now and 2030. And that will add another 900 full-time equivalent positions gradually over time across the country. That's going to be the biggest injection, we think, of jobs into remote Australia in any one program ever. It's all going to be focused on locally run Indigenous organisations. But that also is really important for Australia generally, because traditional owners are increasingly picking up a lot of our work, and in terms of land and sea management across huge areas. WA is no exception, and one of the big ways they're doing that is through Indigenous protected areas, of which there are a number of really big ones in WA, important ones. You mentioned Esperance Dullarack. Those guys haven't got an IPA, but they certainly proposed one a while back, and they've got a functional ranger team, federally funded, really important and strong organisation. It's good to see, kicking goals as they are. I think without getting too bogged down in it, so basically federally, there are more funds that are going to be available to Indigenous organisations going forward, probably from towards the end of this year, for both Indigenous Rangers, and there will be new rounds of Indigenous protected area funding. That, of course, they're national rounds of funding, so it's not necessarily all for WA, but there'll be substantial money starting to become available. But without going into that in too much detail, I think, and given the topic that you guys are trying to talk about, I think something that's worth remembering is that for any local community group and traditional owner-led group to stand up and run an Indigenous protected area or an Indigenous Ranger team is a hell of a lot of work. It's a lot of work on elders, committee members, community members, like anything would be, to make sure they've got the consensus amongst, their own traditional owner group, the clarity about where people are working and the access of where to work, all the employment related aspects of bringing people onto the job, supporting them well in the job, and then getting that operational work done. And so 95% probably of the Indigenous organisations we deal with are absolutely flat to the boards all the time in terms of their bandwidth and their capacity to have much of a dialogue with outside stakeholders. And so I think as people who are working outside the immediate delivery of the range programs and IPAs, part of our job is to be really sensitive to and conscious of those local groups and what they've got any bandwidth or capacity for at any given time. And my sense would be, if you're working with a Landcare group, the first steps are often the common sense ones. It's that I would be focusing on small steps done well, not necessarily really big, overarching, ambitious ambitions, which is all great to have. But I think the community themselves have been overwhelmed with people promising the world and then not delivering. And there's been a long history of that. And sometimes that comes through just lack of experience and an underestimation of how complex it is to deliver, for groups to deliver community-based land and sea management on the ground. And so I'm always of the view that you should under-promise and over-deliver. But some of the first things might be just the basic human things of working out who it is in your region that you should be talking to, and maybe having a cup of tea, creating an opportunity that's informal, doesn't take up too much of people's time, to begin that conversation around what people's aspirations are for country, what you're doing on country, and where the overlap might be, or where even you might take the conversation to a different level. But I would encourage people to start with those small and practical things of just outreach and getting to understand and know who's in your region, and rather than promising the world and then possibly not being able to follow through and deliver. And also have a bit of understanding for the fact that often groups are dealing with a whole range of things, not just the land and sea management priorities. In any given community, people often have multiple roles, lots of pressures on their community organisation or themselves as individuals. Anyone, and I'm sure Mel will attest to this, that's playing any kind of a leadership or even middle leadership role in an Indigenous community that we work with will often be on several committees, different roles within the community, and a lot of that will be unpaid. And so there's just a lot of, claims on people's time. And in some ways, while it's good that people are wanting to interact with and support traditional owner land and sea management more, that increases the burden on people dealing with outsiders and stakeholders and others. So a bit of sympathy for the local group and their chance to get themselves self-organised and to have the headspace to deliver their own priorities, and then perhaps starting with those simple things around outreach, just to say, look, g'day, we're here, this is what we're doing, this is where we're doing it, you're welcome to come and have a look, have a cup of tea, start a conversation. And sometimes those smaller, informal, I think, links can lead to more substantive work down the track, and you can take it stepwise that way. I don't know, I've probably gone on for more than 8 minutes already. Have I, Jacqueline? Or gone
No,
over?
you've got 2 minutes left, Paddy.
Got 2 minutes left.
Questions.
I'm trying to make it all in a nutshell. The other thing, we have worked in WA to encourage the WA government to come up with their own funding to support Indigenous land and sea management too. And, the broad rationale for why we're doing this is there's a number of reasons. Firstly, traditional owners obviously own and have access or have native title rights to a whole lot of land and sea. But even where they don't, there's you might say a historical, moral obligation on all of us to recognise that all of that country is traditional owner country, and there are traditional owners for that country. So we absolutely work with people that don't have title to any land or sea, but they're absolutely keen to see that country managed well. They want to have resources where they can to be able to deliver that management themselves if that's possible. And so just because you're not on Aboriginal land doesn't mean you're not on Aboriginal land, if you know what I mean. And so, in our overall approach, it's trying to say, if we're fair income about looking after the environment and things like Landcare, then we have to put serious resources into it as a country nationally at the state and federal level. And that means dollars, so we're all about, the good sentiment, but we want to see the money, and we want to see it flow in a concerted way so that we can have consistent land and sea management over time. Because I think all of us know that you can't do that with a stop-start project. particularly the case for traditional owners, where often people have been historically, pushed out, marginalised and excluded from making decisions over country. And now we're on a journey about trying to recognise and address that in some way. And particularly the case if you're running a traditional owner-based organisation, you want long-term secure funding, ideally. You want it tailored in the right way, and you want to have some flexibility around how you deliver that so you can support, your own community members in jobs and so forth. And, groups are at all different stages. They're at the startup, some are at the startup stage, they're barely there. Others have been operating for decades and they're absolutely top operators in terms of land and sea management. And I think it's a matter of, working to where people are at the time and having a bit of patience to have the conversations to understand the organisation, the stresses and strains on it, or the people, or if there is an organisation or the individuals, a bit better, so that you can calibrate how best to, have a conversation that might lead to some cooperation down the track or whatever it might be. That's probably enough from me, I reckon. I could go on forever about it, but I won't. I'll try and control myself.
That's excellent, Paddy. Thank you. And you really, that as a nutshell was almost an elevator pitch. You could say that, I reckon, just about anywhere and people would learn something from it. So thank you very much. Any questions from the audience at this stage? Pop your hands up or jump in. Graham from Trackcare, sorry.
Yeah, Paddy, what's your view on private financial funding to community land care? I have an opportunity there working with the Bibbulmun at Canning Stock Group.
Yeah, to get like philanthropic private funding direct to traditional owner groups, you mean? Essentially,
for the projects themselves.
Yeah. Oh, look, I'm all for it. I mean, I think if it's well tailored and well directed and well managed, I mean, that's the key, I think, with any money, whether it's government or private or wherever it comes from. It's really about the understanding and the clarity that people have about the project that you're working on, and then how you actually direct it into which organisation to be able to handle the money and all the rest of it. We're big on advocating for government because we think government should be in the space in a massive way for all our sakes, in Landcare, in Indigenous Landcare, right across the board. But what we find is if that's done well, then philanthropy will often follow. And so I really think, I mean, you'd know the context locally better than me. I think if it's done well, I think sometimes there can be a lot of transaction costs with small amounts of private money, and you have to think that through. The task of actually handling the money, acquitting the money, making sure it's spread, spent and reported on well, that can take up quite a bit of resources of a small organisation. So is there a need to help with that? Can you streamline it some way to make it, keep it accountable but common sense, so that you're not overburdening people? Because in the past, a lot of people would have threaded together, 20 different grants to run a single ranger program for a year. So, you're in the office 3 months applying for money and then 3 months reporting on it, and you've barely got any time to get out and do the work. So, which is why we tried to get bigger flows of tailored money. And then certainly if you want to add on top of that. So I think, you've probably got a sense of the relationships down there and the capacity of local organisations to handle things. Yeah, I think it can be really good if it's contributed in the right way at the right time.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks, Paddy. Before we move on to our next speaker, can you just tell us about the amazing sort of stretch of funding you've managed to secure? Is it in Queensland, your sort of program length?
Well, there's a couple of things. We've pushed a long time for the last 7 or 8 years for longer term contract funding. So one of the things that they did with the federal Rangers was extend their contracts to 2028 in 2020. So that's an 8-year contract. Now, in the world of, that we often deal with in short-term grants, and that's not bad. That's pretty good. It's better than what they had before. They went down at one point to 2 years, which we're not keen on. 5 years we think should be a minimum. 8 years is even better. Look, to be frank, our work is to try and get these things on a quasi-permanent basis, provided that on a yearly basis people are accountable. I don't see why we should be stopping environmental or cultural management work ever. And so it's a bit like, for me, it's like the cops or, some other essential service. You don't think, oh, geez, the police have got funding through till June, but we don't know how they're going to go after that. Everyone assumes it's going to be there, or the military or hospitals or something like that. Yeah. And in terms of the environment, we have to think more seriously about that. In terms of the state-based stuff, one thing I'll just say quickly is Queensland does have a bit of a gold standard program for ranger support at the moment. It's they've got a lot of good funds going in a good way, and they've got a lot of support staff who are skilled at helping groups with their own organisational capacity, planning, reporting, and all the things that you need to do to run the logistics of a land and sea management program. So that's not a bad standard to look at.
Great. Could you share a link in the chat, Paddy, and then we'll circulate it again afterwards? That would be wonderful.
Yeah, and I'd say that's a government-run program rather than a community-run, but it's it actually makes organisations easier for groups like Landcare to deal with because they're healthier organisations.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you. If you could introduce yourself, Judd, and your role, if you happy to speak next, please.
Yeah, no worries. I'm Judd Davis from Balladong Noongar Budja. I lead the Noongar Budja Ranger team, primarily in seed collection. So native seed collection is something we came about through a grant, and it's a seed business, and it's something we've been developing now for over 2 seasons. Massive learning curve for myself. Bit about my background. So I was brought up by my grandfather, Kevin Davis. He's a Balladong elder, and I was always out the bush with him and keen to learn, and he's really the driver of my passion for Landcare. And then later coming into a traineeship with Wheatbelt NRM from high school, I was able to merge that knowledge from the Noongar ecological knowledge, and it came together with the Western science in a big way, and being able to compare has been quite fruitful. But yeah, just in short, we go out in country. Couple of things I'm passionate about is obviously restoring our budja. That's a main driver, but also something you've probably noticed in a lot of the Aboriginal family structures right across Australia, and I definitely know it's true in Noongar country, is the elders are now passing away, or we're missing, a lot of them are missing that elder now to pass on that knowledge. So I'm very passionate about being a custodian of that knowledge, but also sharing it with the younger generations and those who have missed out and unfortunately don't have an elder anymore. But yeah, it's a give and take for me. And that's pretty much the basics of what I do. And yeah.
That's great, Judd. It's terrific to hear about someone who's able to, like many of us in the room, really align our passion with what we do. Can you tell us a bit about the training that you're undertaking at the moment, and where that's provided from, etc.?
Yeah, training. What specific training did you have there?
Is it a certificate that you're doing, or is it delivered?
Oh, okay.
In-house?
So at the moment, I've actually completed the Cert 2 in Conservation Land Management. But since then, I've probably got about 5 years experience just working, listening to mentors and things like that. But now, wanting to undertake some other formal studies. So actually, I'm quite keen to look at a diploma in Conservation Land Management, and also just the other short courses that go with it, like chem training we've got coming up. The guys are going to go through that, and it's this time we're looking at a lot to get the Rangers involved with. A few things on the cards, but yeah, hopefully they'll come up later on.
Terrific. A lot of people talk about how working on country can be so healing for First Nations people. What would be your comment on that, Judd, if you have one?
Yeah, I think it's quite agreeable. One of the comments that kind of resonates with me from the guys going out is they'll go out tree planting and they'll do the hard yakka and be out there for a week or so and plant a few thousand trees, but then they go away, and then we come back when the monitoring happens, and when they see all the growth in the trees, it's like, wow, we did that, we put that back. And that's that satisfaction, that reward of seeing country coming back is definitely quite wholesome, that I've experienced with a lot of our guys and myself. Yeah.
Terrific. Thanks for sharing that. And we might talk to Carla next, who's a business development manager with Wheatbelt NRM, and we may come back to you, Judd. Hopefully at the end we might have a bit more time for Q&A. And in fact, if anyone has a question directly for Judd at the moment, please jump in. Not yet? Okay, lovely. Thanks, Judd.
No worries.
Carla.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to thank Judd for coming on today and speaking, because that was just such an authentic view on it. So it's probably going to make what I'm going to say next just sound administrative. But so I've just joined the organisation as well, and recently also taken on program managing for Wheatbelt Natural Resource Management's Aboriginal NRM team, and they're a fantastic team. And so as Judd was saying about the training, the Rangers have in the past and again doing some retraining now for all of the important skills that they need to work on country out in the field. So vocational training in first aid and the specifics of that conservation land management were units like weed control, native seed collection, plant propagation, all of those awesome green skills units, and the chemical handling, because our rangers do a lot of site preparation and weed control as well. And just wanting to chat a little bit, because I sort of followed there was 3 questions that came in the invitation for this webinar. And I just want to talk a little bit about, how the Aboriginal Rangers are funded and so forth. So, currently, and Judd can correct me if I'm wrong here, because you've been on the scene a lot longer, but, currently our Rangers are funded mostly on a fee-for-service basis. And they are employed within as many Wheatbelt NRM on-ground projects as possible, where there's relevant work for them to do. And they're also attracting a lot of external contracts now through, the local shire doing site management and weed control. And they've also successfully managed to attract a large grounds maintenance contract in our local shire. So that's been able to provide more continual employment because most of our natural resource management projects obviously are quite seasonal. So Judd might be out collecting seed, in spring and summer, and then also a lot of the revegetation, everything is winter, spring. So there are gaps between projects. So it's been a very important progress to be able to keep our ranger team involved and upskilled and engaged in increasing their skills to be able to keep the work being quite ongoing. And going forward into the new regional Landcare tender, if that's successful, there's actually going to be, as Patty was alluding to, there'll be increased minimum targets for both our Aboriginal Ranger contracting work within the projects that are developed through that tender, and also for those Aboriginal employment ratios, which Wheatbelt NRM already meets, but is also always wanting to expand on. If that tender is successful, additional funds will be embedded and allocated within projects for Rangers. But just one of the challenges has been the fact that being funded on fee for service. So a lot of the work our Rangers do has a contract and funding with it, but the organisation, Wheatbelt Natural Resource Management itself, has funded our elders group, who've provided fantastic guidance and information on culture, as Judd said, and also funds some of our staff, our project delivery officer and so forth. So, there's going forward, we will still need to do a lot more business development, and with Judd leading the seed collection business, meeting with Rangers just recently with our elders, they were very appreciative, weren't they, Judd, about how far you've come with their developing a seed collection business within just is it 1 year or 2 years you've been?
One-ish years and a bit. But it really makes me happy when my elders are happy. So
and see, those guys have already got contracts to collect local native seed to supply to some of the carbon companies who are doing revegetation carbon projects, and so that's actually been a really good initiative and we're hoping to actually grow and develop that into a full environmental service, hopefully to actually, develop a nursery. We're already as well planting trees. So we've got one end and the other. So actually planting trees would be good to join that up with environmental service.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Carla, so it sounds like someone's got an echo going here. Can you just check that you're muted, please? Thank you. Is it a social enterprise arm of Wheatbelt NRMs? One of the things that we're looking at today is that sort of collaboration model, and it sounds like your collaboration is very strong there. How does that work as a model?
As Judd might want to comment on as well, but I just want to say first up that at the moment the Rangers are housed within Wheatbelt NRM and are part of, and there has been discussion about creating a more independent entity structure, and we'll be looking into that going forward. But there's obviously there are benefits and risks to that. Because having such a strong relationship with the organisation now, there's a lot of support. In terms of capacity, there's a lot of support now, administratively and operationally and payroll for our rangers, and so there's always how will we manage that if the entities separate? But there's also a lot of advantages for the rangers as well in doing that. So it's just something we'll have to discuss and manage so that all of our existing goodwill and relationships, continue, so that our rangers continue to be available for the natural resource management projects that they're already involved with as well. Because they're actually so good at what they do and getting such a reputation for being responsive and good at their work on country that they might actually get so much work that we can't find them when we need them for a project.
I'm sure that'll probably happen. Thank you, Carla. Any questions for Carla at the moment? Because we will have a bit of time for panel at the end. Okay, thank you. I want to come to Malcolm now and just summarise a little bit, Malcolm, that we've heard very much that this is about relationships and making those relationships, investing that time, considering capacity. Carla's saying that taking care of some of that administrative and corporative stuff is really supportive for the evolving Ranger group at the moment. And can you tell us a bit about your experience in the Kimberley, please? You don't have any sound, Malcolm.
What about now?
Can turn it up a bit, might be better. I could hear you when you first joined, but I can't hear you now.
What about now? No?
Yes, that's great.
Okay. No worries. Okay, yeah, so thanks everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to join. I did ask some of our Ranger partners if they were available to chat as well, but unfortunately, as Paddy explained, they're all very busy. So yeah, I'm an ecologist and I work for an organisation called Environs Kimberley. We're a not-for-profit environmental group in Kimberley. And we do a lot of campaign work, but also for the last 17 years, we've actually been supporting Aboriginal Ranger Groups or community groups to do on-country conservation projects. So I've been involved for about 11 of those years. So we're now at the point where we're working with about 12 or 13 different Aboriginal Ranger Groups, and we've got a team of about 8 or 9 environmental scientists in our team working with all those different groups. So over those, 16, 17 years we've been working with these groups, we've done a whole range of projects. Our strength lies in kind of your more Landcare type projects like weed management, fire management and restoration. But we've done a lot of threatened species surveys and biodiversity work. And what's actually developed is through these long-term relationships we've got with these ranger groups. We've branched into new areas we're not used to doing because the ranger groups said, oh, can we get some help, working with the local schools? So then all of a sudden we're developing educational resources, or, we'd love to move into the social enterprise space. So we're working with some of the ranger groups on developing sort of seed collecting and kind of restoration activities like I was talking about, which aren't as developed up here in the Kimberley. So yeah, we've done a lot of work with a lot of different range groups in the Kimberley. But as you kind of mentioned in the beginning, you know, things are different between different regions. So the only way we are able to do such extensive work for so long with so many different range groups is because, you know, the Kimberley is different to other parts of WA, and the Kimberley Land Council in particular did a really amazing job in, you know, securing a lot of native title for groups, but also a lot of this kind of range networks set up by KLC. So it meant us as a partner, these range groups were generally funded, had support for training and some admin. They were initially supported by KLC, but then a lot of these groups have now become independent through their own prescribed body corporate, and are now run by their own kind of cultural groups. So for us as partners, we were very much able to just to pair with these groups that were already really supported. So I just really want to flag that our situation is very different elsewhere in WA. So yeah, I guess looking at those questions that were sent through, I guess if we were approaching a new group, and I should also flag that most of our work has been done with in the Kimberley, but through our work, we've had people ask to support Aboriginal Ranger groups elsewhere. So we're actually now working with a group out of Cairns, strangely. So we're Environs Kimberley, also working in Queensland. And we've also worked with a group, one of our staff members moved back to Victoria. So they supported the Watherong Aboriginal group outside Geelong. And that was probably in a context which is much more similar to areas in the Wheatbelt, where it was a much more, you know, the land was much more divided between a whole bunch of different landholders, unlike in the Kimberley. So I think if we were, you know, approaching or trying to work with a new range group, you know, for us there's a couple of key things. And I think a lot of them is just repeating what Paddy had kind of mentioned, which is, you know, make sure you do your background research. You know, who is the native title group or the cultural group for your area? You know, just to get across that, you know, what information's out there. Do they have website? You know, do they have any reports? Do they have any, you know, is there any kind of, you know, stuff in the local museum? All that sort of stuff, just to actually get that background knowledge is really, really important. You know, and in particular around the native title stuff. And as Paddy mentioned, you know, just because groups don't have native title doesn't mean they have really strong cultural links and it isn't their country, it just hasn't been recognised formally. I think what's really important is, you know, looking at building kind of long-term relationships, which means that things might not happen quickly because, as Paddy said, everyone is really busy and sometimes it does take a while just to build these relationships. So it might take time before you even hit a project on the ground together. But the idea is if you take that time to do it slowly, then it's going to build strong relationships, which, you know, should last a really long time, not just for one project. So I think that's really important. So whether that is doing that background research shows you're interested and you're actually putting your own input, but just having those cups of tea, you know, reaching out to people. I think what's important is trying to see where, whatever your group is and the Aboriginal group, local group, to see where your values align. So, you know, that's really important. You know, there are a lot of places in this kind of bush for generation or Landcare area. There's so many places where our values do align, the more Western conservation values with, you know, traditional owner values, but they don't always align. And that seems to be really important and to have those conversations. And that's okay. It's just recognizing where things align and where things don't. So, you know, one different ways to actually kind of work out what are the ways that your values align. Up in the Kimberley in particular, there's a lot of groups that have a thing called a healthy country plan, which is a plan which was developed by the Aboriginal group and their community to say, what are our 10-year objectives for our country and our culture? What do we want to prioritise? What are we most worried about? What are our strategies to fix that? And basically, it's just a general kind of management plan that you might have for any bit of bush or any threatened species. So other groups might not have to call it a healthy country plan, but it might be a cultural plan, or they might have done some planning in a workshop to work out what their goals are for their country. I think it's really important, if that is available and publicly available, to ask for those sort of documents, because these healthy country plans in the Kimberley, and there's more of these are now being developed elsewhere around Australia, but that specifically says, us as a traditional owner group, we were really worried about this one wetland because it's being destroyed by cattle or whatever. So then as a partner, we can go, hey, we read your plan and we saw you're really concerned about that. Can we help you with that? Or can, you know, is there any way we can collaborate with that? So it's a way of not having to do the consultation, because these groups actually often really clearly distinguish what their important values are. Now, sometimes the group might say to you, oh yeah, no, that's a bit outdated now, that's fine. But at least it's showing you're actually getting aware of what the priorities are for those groups are. And then I think once it's, developing those two-way relationships, open, kind of clear communications. And then through those conversations, you might come across a project where you can work together on, where you kind of got the shared priorities and shared objectives to come out of that. And then if that's the case, then it's working together to seek funding or, develop that project together. And then I think what's really important is then developing that project through all stages of that. It's not just coming and say, how can we get your help to collect some seed? And then that group helps you and then you never talk to them again. It's really about all the steps through that process. So I guess for us, we've kind of, through our years, we've kind of developed a bit of a working kind of procedures or whatever in terms of how we work with our range groups. And really it's kind of based on 3 areas of respect. So one's kind of respect for cultural knowledge, practice and priorities. So that's, respecting that, cultural knowledge and cultural practice should be valued as much, or in some cases more than scientific values. And actually, if you combine them together, it leads to better scientific values and conservation outcomes. I think what's really important is for any science project to acknowledge that traditional language and culture is as threatened or sometimes more threatened than some of the species we work with. So within your project, if you can find ways and really make that effort to document or support those groups to document their knowledge or cultural or language and use that language as much as possible. Sometimes as scientists, we don't even think about the fact that we force Latin language names onto people, but then we don't work to actually learn the traditional names as well. So really make an effort to learn those local languages names and try and use those names. And you'll be laughed at for pronouncing it wrong, but that's a really important, part of a relationship is to be laughed at. So then, if you are helping support the documentation of any of this knowledge or cultural language, then there's always that respect that IP should remain with those TOs. So you support that to be collected or documented, but that IP is always remaining in those TO groups. And then just the last one in terms of that respect, that first point was around, acceptance and awareness of any cultural practice or protocols. If someone says don't go there for cultural reasons, don't go there. It's pretty obvious, but it's amazing how often it still happens that people go to areas they shouldn't and do things they shouldn't. The second thing around is respect for cultural knowledge holders. So as we spoke about, those elders, treating them as experts. You might bring in a consultant who's an expert scientist. Well, those elders are experts as well, and they should be paid or respected in a similar way. And also respecting those Aboriginal governance bodies. So whether it's an elders organisation that's been set up through an NRM body or that they have themselves, really respecting them. That means going to them for endorsement and their feedback and their input. It's amazing how many projects get permits from government departments, but then don't get the equivalent cultural permits. We should respect it similarly. The third thing is about that respect for long-term partnerships. So making sure all groups and partners are project funded, So sometimes in the beginning, we were writing grants that paid for fee-for-service for rangers and elder wages, as well as wages for ourselves. Both of us relied on the project funding. Collaboration through all aspects of the project, as I spoke about. Making sure the project is communicated to multiple audiences. So you might produce a report or a scientific paper or something like that to your Landcare group or to your local network, but you also want to make sure it's communicated to the local First Nations community. So communicating the one project to multiple different audiences is really important. And then
That's great. Sorry, Malcolm, go on, one more thing.
That's all. That's probably, I've spoken for long enough. And just like Paddy, I could talk forever about this, and Paddy and I often do talk forever about this.
You caught it. I'd just like to stitch it a bit together, saying that, we do have this sense that we didn't have questions at the end because some are quite specific. But if I spoke to Harry Watson on your patch, and we asked Judd here, and I talked to Oral Maguire, and we talked to Mob down at Esperance, we'd hear that those respect key elements. And the work I've done in the NT in Queensland, it's all the same. That those core principles and values are critical across the country to engage effectively and meaningfully.
That's right.
So, thank you for that. I think we have a direct question that was logged earlier from Chris Howe from LCC about fire, and then we're going to go to Sue Morley to hear a bit about the Bibbulmun experience working with rangers doing maintenance. Chris.
There was a question around traditional fire practices and whether how other groups have approached getting insurance for that. That's a barrier that we've hit down here in the southwest. That no one will insure it, essentially.
Paddy.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a real live question at the moment. And if it's any reassurance, it's probably not. It's a bit of an issue nationally. I reckon there's two things going on. There are a whole set of groups that are out there practicing and doing fire management in places like the desert and Arnhem Land and probably the Kimberley, I'd guess. And on a bit of a don't ask, don't tell. They've got insurance. They haven't been engaging much around the recent dialogue around insurance, and they're finding the premiums are manageable. Some places in the Northern Territory, some of the Aboriginal land councils are quasi-government statutory authorities, and so they can get insured by, I think, a form of government insurance. I think it's going to become an increasing issue, to be frank, and I think particularly in places like where you are, where it's more densely settled, there's properties and buildings, it'll be the same in the southeast. So I don't think we've got a national solution for it yet, but we're acutely aware that that's going to be a problem because premiums are being driven up. And in some cases in New South Wales, arrangements with local fire brigades have for the time being made a bit of an arrangement where you can kind of get cover through some kind of a delegation or arrangement through the local emergency services or fire brigade. But I actually think it's something that Australia as a whole has to come to grips with in all sorts of ways. And it's not just for fire, it's going to be for flood as well and things like that. But yeah, so short answer is not very satisfactory, but it's a question that needs to be answered, and it's not being systematically solved at the moment. We have actually proposed or considered whether we do something a bit more systematic on it. But to do that, you've got to kind of bring it out into the open. And I think some of the groups that are not yet getting pinged by it are like, oh, you know, we're okay for the moment. Do we really need to talk about this? But our feeling is that it's going to be inevitable down the track. Mel might have a view, I mean, from the Kimberley side.
Yeah, I mean, even in the Kimberley where it isn't as densely populated, KLC holds insurance for all these ranger groups, and they're struggling with it. Their premiums are going up and they're really struggling with it. So they support the groups by covering it through their insurance, but it's really, really tough. I think for groups down south, I think what might be good is to open up dialogue with, so DFES have a Centre for like Bushfire Excellence or something they recently just set up.
Yeah.
And there's a big component of that is around cultural burning. So I think it's having conversations with them. Either they're aware of it and they might have some way, as kind of Paddy explained, where DFES might be able to actually, you might be able to fall under them and they might be able to be present and therefore kind of cover it. Or otherwise, if they don't have a solution, they're aware of it, because it is, if they're talking about cultural burning and they want to actually promote that through DFES, they need to make sure it can actually happen from an insurance policy point of view. So if they don't have a way to deal with it now, then I think whoever's involved here and elsewhere should actually get onto them and actually start lobbying for them to come up with a solution.
Yeah.
Thanks, Malcolm. Carla. You're on mute.
You're on mute, Carla.
Just a quick comment, because I don't have a solution to add, but I believe one of our program managers is in discussion with DFES, who are wanting to undertake some cultural burning work with our rangers, and I would assume that they wouldn't be willing to come and do that and help with the mutual learning and training if there wasn't a way for it to occur and be insured. So there must be a solution.
Yeah,
It'd be interesting, Paddy, to see what Victor Stephenson's doing. Is it, you know, don't ask, don't tell sort of philosophy there with the Fire Sticks Alliance?
I think there might be a little bit of that. I'm not sure, to be honest, because it's like in some respects, I think there's a difference between, well, there's two different things. I think one of the important things that Victor's doing is reintroducing a lot of people to cultural fire and the whole concept. But that's a little bit different from a year-long program of land management overall, of which fire is one really important component. It's not going to be the only one, but you're going to be doing it year in, year out. And so I think we're happy to keep in touch with yourself, Jacqueline, if we are able to find a way to progress the discussion, basically. And fundamentally, I think that Australia is going to have to come to grips with this on a number of levels, federal and state governments. So
terrific. I agree, and I'd love to pursue that. There's a lot of different elements happening in the southwest at the moment around fire, the complexity of the question sitting fire outside of overall cultural land management. That could be another conversation, but also the piece about ILC and land transfer and ownership, big tracts of land, and people not having the money for fire. So it's a conversation that needs to be had. The National Landcare Network probably be quite happy to pick that one up and work with you and someone like Q on it, because it sounds like a policy issue. I'm going to move across Sue Morley from the Bibbulmun Track Foundation to talk a bit about rangers doing maintenance for you, Sue. You need to unmute. We all forget, don't we? Oh, I still can't hear you, Sue. You might have to come out of your headset. Sorry. No, still no audio.
So put
That's
your
better.
microphone down.
That's better.
Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, all right, fine. You might just get some background noise. But anyway, look, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Bibbulmun Track, it's a world-class hiking trail. It's been around for many, many years, 25 years, in fact. It stretches for about 1,000 kilometres from Perth down to Albany. We've got over 400 volunteers that maintain the track. And we sort of recognise that, one, we're involved with developing the WA hiking trail standards in conjunction with Parks and Wildlife and DBCA. And we recognise the need to incorporate that into some sort of training for people how to look after the trails. So we developed WA's first trail maintenance course last year, and recognising that since COVID, there's been multiple trails being built by shires and by government in WA. But there's little recognition for the absolute need to maintain them, and how do you do that? So we are currently in a partnership with the Indigenous Rangers down in Albany, and we provide training to the Rangers to maintain on how to maintain the trails and how to look after and do conservation so that it protects, say, the fragile sand dunes around the Albany sort of Franklin areas. For the Rangers themselves, it's fantastic for them because they're actually going out and caring for country. And so it's also a sort of a healing experience. But for us, it's absolutely invaluable because we're able to share a lot of knowledge, cultural knowledge with them in regards to their skills about caring for country. And we're able to sort of impart, you know, how to do maintenance, how to lay down track pad, how to stop sand erosion, you know, how to protect sort of the sand dunes and stuff like that. So it's a win-win sort of situation. They're sort of also looking at particularly learning about trail maintenance so they can eventually become a fee for service in regards to that, and so that they can assist where there might be contract requirements to go out and construct something or maintain a trail or do some clearing and stuff like that. So we sort of see it as an opportunity, and they see it as well as an opportunity to get young people on board as potential future employment, and also as a diversionary thing as well, to sort of get them back out on country and really it's their own country anyway, and the fact that they can actually sort of be able to care for it in the way that they do is it's quite meaningful.
It's terrific, Sue. Thank you very much. Can I, in the absence of any questions, can I throw to the floor? One of the issues that our members talk about is that, you know, when they're applying for grants through state NRM or federal or whatever, there's this requirement, which is really important and critical, and it's great to see it increased for more Aboriginal engagement and for more employment outcomes, all of the things that COAG originally identified, that NRM was a space in which a great contribution could be made towards closing the gap if only we would take that opportunity seriously. Is the resourcing for relationship building and engagement seems to be an area that might be something that you'd like WALN to advocate on, because we know that this question is asked, you know, where are your relationships? Who have you consulted with? At what point did you do that? Picking up on what Malcolm was saying before, that the country, caring for country plans, or those plans that I was talking to someone in the Pilbara about theirs the other day, it may be that if we can support groups to do more of that, would that be a way to assist groups, A, in the consultation process, but B, how are we going to resource the time and effort that it takes to build those relationships? And in my experience, sometimes there's one person in an organisation who's actually doing that. When that person leaves, as inevitably happens, what happens to the years of relationship and knowledge capital that's existed in that person? So, Paddy?
You can hear me all right, I think. I think it's a legit and genuine question. I think that one of the challenges has always been this, is that, say with the federal resources or even the state-based resources that are tailored for Indigenous land and sea management, the preference is always those go to Indigenous groups. And so to be, so it's unlikely probably that kind of funding would go to non-Indigenous groups to raise their capacity to deal back with Indigenous groups, if you know what I mean, even though I see it as, just a genuine resource issue. And so that aside, I think, partially, yeah, look, probably no simple answer other than, trying to get a lot of environment funding away from piecemeal and project related only to some sustained capacity funding across the board helps everyone, in the sense that you've got people that can spend and invest that time. I don't really know, I have to confess, I don't really know the NRM and Landcare situation in WA that well, but in Queensland and other places, there are times probably in the past where I would have gone to some of those guys and said, look, you've got resources that you could put into this and you're not putting it into it, but you can't necessarily, you've probably got to reprioritize some of your resources. I don't know whether that's even a fair question for WA, because I don't know what, often you go to people and people are like completely strapped for resources, or that's what their feeling is,
That tends to be the case in WA, I'm afraid. Thank you, Paddy. Louise, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Paddy, actually, because the actual climate is moving in the opposite direction. So the climate for funding for Landcare is actually moving more towards a capital raising type of scenario, where you're going to market for biodiversity credits and things like that. So I just wondered how, when the actual market and the landscape, even what the Albanese government is doing, is taking us towards a more project-based approach, how that's going to kind of fit together, really. I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
Boy, that's, I could try and answer quickly, because I'd love to talk about that for hours, but I'll just put it out there. I'm a skeptic of the biodiversity market approach. I think government has a lot of core funding they can put directly to funding things like land care and community-based work and other work, and they're not doing it. And part of our job is to get them to do it. Now, that's not necessarily an anti-market or project-based approach statement. It's just simply saying sometimes you've got to just fund directly and recognise the value of prioritising that money as you would for other essential services. And so then on top of that, there might be down the track other mechanisms that you can use to bring in. But I tell you what, if you can't, and this would go for a lot of Indigenous groups too, to try and have the transaction costs of working in one of those kind of fee for service or market-based environments is extremely difficult. And I've seen it crash organisations time and again, because of the intermittent nature of the market or the fees, the transaction costs involved with pitching for work. I mean, some places that model works well. For the vast bulk of community-based stuff, I don't think it works very well at all. So that's just a personal view. Others might have a different view.
That's great, Paddy. And in hearing you say talk about it for hours, it is being talked about for hours everywhere, what the opportunities are. Organisations are being resource starved, crashed, and their resources being used up chasing what looks like opportunities that don't necessarily materialize. And I think there's a forum there for WALN to look at later in the year about, you know, where are the best places for us to focus our attention? Are there opportunities? And over time, we will see indeed that this environmental marketplace is new to this country. It's an experiment, and a bit like, shall we say, cane toads to eat beetles, it could go terribly wrong.
One thing I'd say is we don't have a market to fund the police or defence or anything we take really seriously.
Yeah, good point. We've got 2 seconds, Carla, for a quick one from you. Jump in.
Just needed to unmute. Sorry, I'm not going to comment on natural capital because that's another one of my business development roles. I just wanted to come back to one of your original questions. I'll be really quick, just sort of as a wrap up, really. That question that was there, how can community Landcare groups work collaboratively with Aboriginal Ranger groups? And just coming back to the grassroots level, so to speak, my recollection of how that really came about in Balladong country, where Wheatbelt natural resource management work is, you know, and talking about how can Landcare groups work collaboratively with Indigenous groups and elders is a fantastic elders group was formed originally. And I think some of the first amazing projects that brought all the stakeholders, relevant stakeholders together was because the elders were consulted about where their local significant sites are located. We have the Avon River running through our region, Avon River Basin, which becomes the Swan River, which runs into Perth, the capital city. And obviously, so some of the local significant cultural sites were actually located and discussed, and some of the early projects that brought people working together on country really well were to go back and restore and reinstate the cultural significance of some of those sites and record some of the cultural knowledge that belonged to those sites originally. And just in my memory, that was just on a practical level, you know, how people got to be working together. As for all the higher level funding, I agree that something consistent would be great, so that it's not on a cycle all the time.
Yeah, that's great, Carla. Thank you. I just want to draw people's attention to the chat for a moment, just before we close. The link is in there from Paddy to the Strong on Country and other reports that talk to that successful model in Queensland. We're going to capture that and share it with you through our follow-up email. There's some more happening, and they're very interesting too, about fire insurance. So there's a note there about Gallagher's as an insurance company, and the broker contact Kirk Camboris. So there's a phone number in there that we'll also share. So there's some of the great opportunities that come out of a session like this, is we can hear and learn about things that are happening. I thank you all for your time to participate. I don't know about you all, but there seems to just be, and I guess it's the advent of the marketplace as well, and also the tender that's happening, but everybody's just so busy. And I really appreciate the time commitment that our guest speakers have made, Paddy O'Leary, Malcolm Lindsey, Judd Stead and Carla Swift. Thank you so much for coming along, and to all of you for sharing your wisdom and your thoughts with us today. There's a couple of new things in the chat. I'll just have a quick look. Yep, lots of big thank yous, and keep up the great work in the Ranger space. It's really critical work that we're doing. We'll start trying to find some long-term investment and help to solve some of the problems if we can. Thank you. Caroline, can you stay on, please?